Welcome to this tutorial, which will focus on how to complete the competencies and submission documents that are needed when working towards becoming a chartered member of the RICS. Having helped a number of colleagues pass their APC over the last 5 years, I compiled this video to provide some guidance and address a lot of the common questions I often hear from candidates about completing the submission documentation. I really try to encourage my colleagues and APC candidates to place a lot of importance on the quality of the submission documents, as the assessors will use these to form their first opinion of the candidate, and the majority of the questioning within the final assessment interview is based around your submission. So it's really important to do a really good job in completing this and to also make sure that you know the document inside out. I think in this case there's nothing more useful than actually running through some live examples of submission documents that have successfully been used previously. I will leave a link to those in the description below, and this will provide a template and a guide on how to populate your own submission. We'll also review the example submissions in detail and demonstrate how to achieve each of the competencies that are needed at levels 1, 2 and 3. I often hear from candidates say that they are lacking experience in a number of different competencies, and this is very common, so I'll try to explain how to think about your experience in a way that will allow you to allocate it into as many competencies as possible, and this will really help you address any shortfalls that you've got within your experience. For anybody out there feeling really overwhelmed by the APC and the documentation in particular, I'll also give a step-by-step guide on which activities you need to complete each month and really try to break this down into manageable tasks. I'll explain what you should be focusing on within your supervisor and counsellor meetings. And finally, we'll look at how the assessors will use the submission documentation to form the basis of their questioning within the final assessment interview, and also how you can use it to structure your own revision and anticipate the topics the assessors may base their questions on. As always, the PDF version of these notes is available to download in the description, and in this case, as I say, the submission documents from previous candidates will be really useful, so I'll also leave those in the description below. I will be posting weekly APC tutorials and Q&A practice, so please keep in touch by subscribing to this channel and posting any questions that you've got within the comments section. So firstly, before we get into the real examples of the previous submission documents, what is the summary of experience? So essentially, this is a record of your real-life surveying experience. This is comprised of brief statements and explanations, and you'll be allocating your experience against each of the competencies that are set out. You'll need to do this at various different levels depending on what competency you're focusing on. So level 1 is purely knowledge based. Level 2 is your evidence of where you've actually carried out tasks in your day-to-day surveying experience and achieved those competencies. And level 3 is where you've collated the evidence where you've provided advice to your client. Before you start populating the submission documentation, I'd really recommend printing out each of the competency guides and pathway guides that is specific to your discipline. And within these guides, it clearly sets out all of the different competencies that need to be achieved, and it goes one step further in that it also details out examples of what you can refer to for each competency. So I think the first job that I would advise is really just to print out these guides. You can come back to these when you're completing your submission documentation and sense check all the examples that you're populating. I also mentioned that the guides, the pathway guides and the competency guides are all available to download from the RICS website. On this slide, I've just brought up an extract of the mandatory competencies guide, and you can see there are 11 number mandatory competencies that every APC candidate needs to achieve in total. So these are ranging from level 1, for example, things like accounting principles and procedures, business planning and data management, going up to level 2, demonstrating client care, communication and negotiation, and then level 3 is the ethics, rules of conduct and professionalism competency. Looking more specifically at some of the different pathway requirements that are relevant to your discipline. So in this case, this is an extract from a quantity surveying and construction pathway. So again, you can see within this guide, it advises each of the mandatory competencies you need to achieve, in addition to the core competencies. So typically, these will be 6 number competencies that you need to achieve at a core level. You'll then need to choose a further 2 optional competencies that you'll need to achieve up to level 2. As you drill down into more detail and actually start to populate your submission documentation, again, really make sure that you refer back to the competency guides, as it does give some really specific examples of how you can demonstrate competencies at each level. So this is another extract of the mandatory competencies. So you can see here for accounting principles and procedures, which you need to achieve up to level 2, and it clearly details some examples of what you can refer to within your own documentation. So you can see here, if you've ever been involved in reviewing financial statements to establish the strength of a company, you can refer to that as experience at level 2. Obviously, level 1, you can refer to your knowledge of the financial statements that businesses provide, such as balance sheets, profit and loss statements, and cash flow statements. So these are just really useful because they clearly set out some very specific examples of what you can refer to in your own submission. Again, looking in more detail at one of the core competencies specific to the quantity surveying pathway, again, it just gives some really good examples and a lot of detail in terms of what you can refer to achieve these competencies. So looking at level 3 there, if you've ever been involved in providing cost advice to a client and helping them choose different design solutions, whether that be a comparison between foundation solutions or a frame solution, you could refer to that there. At level 2, again, if you've ever been involved in inspecting buildings or reviewing design proposals, in doing that, you're gaining an appreciation of how different elements of the building interrelate. And again, you can use that experience to demonstrate that you've achieved the level 2 competency there. So before we get into the main summary of experience example and look at this in more detail, I just thought I'd give some quick guidance on best practice, how to complete the submission documentation. So currently, all candidates are required to submit their summary of experience via the ARC portal on the RICS website, but I would recommend keeping an offline version of this. And this is just so you can perform things like the spell check. You can keep that offline version secure and backed up. And you can also take this into your meetings with your supervisor and counsellor and quickly amend this as a electronic copy, which again I'll leave in the link in the description below. So I would really recommend maintaining a offline version as well as the ARC version. As I said before, make sure you print out each of the competency and pathway guides so you can refer back to the examples listed in there, and you can sense check your own summary of experience against those guides. I'd also advise on trying to complete the submission document as you gain experience. From my own experience of the APC, I typically spend 15 to 20 minutes every Friday at the end of each week populating the documentation when the experience was fresh in my mind. I'd also advise not exaggerating within your experience, so don't try and play something out to be something that it's not. Ultimately, when you're in the final assessment, the assessors will expect you to talk them through the experience that you've gained. So don't try to exaggerate this, because all they're really looking for is that you're a safe pair of hands and you've operated at a fairly intermediate level. They're not going to expect you to go in and say, I've just managed a £100 million scheme within the interview. So try your best there not to exaggerate experience, and always try to remain inside your own area of specialism when referring to your experience. Obviously, review your summary of experience with your counsellor and supervisor. I'd recommend doing this every 3 months in order to sign off those competencies, and also to identify any areas where you may have some shortfalls in experience. When populating the submission documents, try to be really concise and make sure that you use good grammar. As I said before, the assessors will look at this prior to the final assessment interview, and this is essentially the assessor's first opinion of the candidate. So, as I say, it's really important to try and do a really good job in submitting this. Obviously, make sure you refer back to the guides and be fully conscious of the word counts that are in place. I have heard stories of people falling foul of the word counts, especially on their case study and in their submission, and the assessors really giving candidates a hard time because of this. So always make sure that you're really, really conscious of the word counts that are in place. Finally, make sure that you try to be as broad as possible within your experience. So make sure that you're not only referring to one client throughout the documentation. Try to refer to a couple of different clients. Try to refer to a couple of different forms of building contract. If you're obviously from a construction background, if you're from more of a general practice or building surveying background, again, try to make sure that you have experience in a number of different sectors, whether that's commercial property, offices and retail, and try to give the assessors a real insight into you having a broad range of experience. So without further ado, let's take a look at this previous version of a submission document that was submitted by a colleague that I helped a number of years ago. So I'm just first of all scrolling down to the summary of experience, looking at the mandatory competencies. So the first competency we'll take a look at is the conduct rules, ethics and professional practice. At level 1, you can see the candidate here is referring to their knowledge of the global professional and ethical standards, and also of the Bribery Act. So if we then look at this experience, and we can then sense check this against the APC guides to make sure that we're along the right lines here. So if we go back to the pathway guide, again at level 1, you can see the guide is advising there that to achieve the competency of ethics, rules, conduct and professionalism, they're looking for examples where the client has a good understanding of the global and professional and ethical standards, which the candidate in this case clearly referred to. So it's a really good match back to the guide, and I'd be very confident in what the candidate here has put in question. They've also referred to the Bribery Act 2010 there, which again, if you go back to the guide, it does refer to having a understanding of common law in place. So again, that's a direct match to what the RICS are looking for at level 1. So I think the candidate in this case has done a really good job there of addressing the level 1 experience that's needed. If we then go back to the submission documentation, again looking at level 2 now of the same competency, so you can see here that the candidate again is referring to their own experience of lifelong learning, and they're demonstrating that they have maintained their CPD record, which all RICS members are required to submit a set amount of CPD per year. Again, if we go back to the candidate guide to sense check this experience against, it clearly references there a requirement to comply with the RICS CPD requirements, which again is a direct match back to the competency guide. So again, just looking at this submission document, the candidate in question has done a really good job of sense checking their experience against the guide. Moving down to level 3, so the candidate is now referring to their own experience where they have complied with the RICS rules of conduct in question, and they're talking about how they've how they have ensured that their professional indemnity insurance is in place, which again, if we go back to the guide and sense check this against, it clearly says there setting up professional indemnity insurance and giving advice there to make sure that the firm in question is compliant with the RICS rules of conduct for firms. So again, I think the candidate in question here has done a really good job populating their submission and then sense checking that experience back against the RICS mandatory competencies guide. So you can see as a process there just how important it is to have those guides in place so you can refer back to them and list out examples of your experience and how that fits into the RICS competencies. So one of the questions that I hear from a lot of candidates is that they have a shortfall in experience and they are struggling to achieve one or two of the competencies that are needed. And this is really, really common. This is something that I talk about with a lot of candidates, and I really just try to encourage them to think about their experience in as broader terms as possible. So for example, if anybody is from a QS discipline and if you've been undertaking a measuring exercise, taking off quantities from project drawings, not only are you achieving the quantification and costing competency, but you're also reviewing the project drawings and gaining an understanding of how the elements of the building interrelate. So you're also achieving the construction technology competency. So this is an example of how your experience can be allocated into more than just one competency. Likewise, if you're undertaking an interim valuation, not only are you achieving the project financial control competency, but you're also feeding into contract administration if you're ever raising a payment certificate, and you're also feeding into the optional competency of risk management. So again, this is just an example of how experience can be allocated into more than just one competency, and this is something that you really need to try and adopt in terms of a way of thinking to make sure that you can allocate your experience as broadly as possible. Your supervisor and counsellor should also be advising you of how to achieve this and allocate your experience. Not only should they be signing off your experience at each of the required levels, but if there is a shortfall that you're just really struggling to address, then they should be helping you to try and get the required experience for that particular competency. But in this case, if there's anybody out there who's really struggling to achieve a competency and they just feel as though they're coming up short, if you please drop me a comment in the comment section and I will try to assist with this where possible. And again, this next point is really just going back to the assessors wanting to try and see a good range and a good spread of experience across the board. So I would recommend that as you go along and you gain experience, try to maintain a professional diary that allows you to track the number of days experience that you've got against each competency, and this will allow you to make sure that you have as broader experience as possible and you don't have any shortfalls in any particular area. So again, I will include a Excel version of the diary template that I used a few years ago, And again, this template will just be really useful, but because it will allow you to track each of your number of recorded hours against the competencies and try to achieve, a good spread of hours recorded against them. So if you ever did see on a graph when you use this template a shortfall, that lets you know that you need to try and address that shortfall and gain more experience in that area. And what you should see towards the end of your structured training period, whether that's 12 months or 24 months, you should see a really good range of experience across this graph with minimal shortfalls. So in terms of advice in how to complete the submission document, I just thought I'd also call out some of the key do's and don'ts. So I think the first piece of advice that I'd give would be when you're planning your revision, try to structure your revision for the final assessment around your submission documentation. And try to have a really good understanding of what you have put in that document and base your revision around that. In the mock interviews that I've done, there's nothing worse than trying to question a candidate on their own submission, for them not to be able to refer to that experience or draw a blank and not be fully aware of what they've put within their own document. So just really try to base a majority of your revision around your own submission documentation and really have a good appreciation of this and expect the assessors to ask you to talk them through the experience that you've listed. As I've said before, try to operate with really good grammar and be really concise and conscious of the word counts. As I say, the assessors will form their first opinion of you before the final assessment, and the way that they do that is by reading your submission. So really try to be as professional as you can be, use good grammar and be really concise. As I said before, try to include reference to multiple clients, multiple types of projects and multiple types of contracts to make sure that your experience is as appearing as broad as it can be to the assessors. As I mentioned previously, don't overplay experience, so try not to exaggerate, because the assessors aren't expecting you to go in at a really senior or senior partner type of level. They will be expecting you to be a safe pair of hands and operating at a fairly intermediate level. So just be really conscious not to overplay experience and always try to operate within your own area of discipline. Don't not have an understanding of what's in your submission document. As I said before, there's nothing worse than querying something with an APC candidate only for them to draw a blank and not be fully aware of what they've listed in their submission. And this even goes as far as the CPD requirements that are listed. Always make sure that you have a good understanding of the CPD that you've referred to. Don't only ever refer to one client, one type of contract or one sector. The assessors do want to see that you've had a broad range of experience working on a number of different projects with a number of different clients. So try to refer to as many of these as possible without overplaying experience. For anybody out there feeling just really overwhelmed by the submission documentation and this process, I have compiled a step-by-step guide of the activities that you can complete each month, which again is available to download in the description below. But in terms of steps that you can work through, in terms of next steps, I'd firstly advise on printing out the competency and pathway guides so you can refer to those. I would set up a offline electronic version of the submission documentation, which again is included in the link in the description below, and just look to try and maintain this with your experience every Friday for around 15 to 20 minutes while that experience is still fresh in your mind. As I said before, try to maintain a diary log or competency tracker so you can identify any shortfalls in your experience. Again, I will include the diary log in the template below, which can be used and amended so it's specific to your own pathway. Always be sure to review your experience with the supervisor and counsellor, and I would really advise on doing that a minimum of every 3 months, and sign off the competencies at each level with your supervisor and counsellor, and also try to address any shortfalls of experience, not only by thinking as broadly as possible, but if you do have any genuine concerns, then you should really be raising that with your supervisor and counsellor. As final assessment nears, this guide, which again, the step-by-step guide is available to download, is all geared around having your documentation and case study presentation completed in a really timely manner before the APC final assessment. And this strategy that I try to encourage all the colleagues and candidates that help really just allows you to focus purely on your revision prior to the final assessment and the presentation preparation. There's nothing worse than being stressed or using that time before the final assessment to complete the documentation. So this plan that is available to download in the description is all geared around being organised and making sure that you've got your documents completed in a timely manner, so it will allow you to focus on revision prior to the final assessment. As I mentioned, all of the learning materials from today are available to download in the link in the description below. This includes 2-number example submission documents, the APC diary template to monitor and track against your competencies. It includes an electronic copy of the APC summary of experience, so you can record this offline, as well as using the ARC portal. It contains a step-by-step guide of the activities to complete each month. I will also be posting other videos on mock Q&A over the coming weeks, so please subscribe to this channel and keep in touch, and please submit any comments or questions that you have. If you are genuinely out there feeling overwhelmed by this process, or you have any APC related queries, I will try to come back to all of the comments that people post. So if you do have any questions or concerns, please keep in touch by posting any comments that you may have. Thank you for watching this presentation, and best of luck with completing your submission documentation. Thank you.